There are some rumors in reality television that flare up fast and burn out just as quickly. And then there are the ones that never really go away. They fade into the background for a while, resurface in comment sections, get whispered about in forums, and then suddenly explode again, louder, darker, and more disturbing than before. This is one of those rumors. If you've spent any real time in the Sister Wives fandom, chances are you've seen it mentioned at least once. Sometimes it's framed as a question, sometimes as a theory, and sometimes, troublingly, it's presented as fact. The claim is shocking on its face that Janelle Brown once kneed Meri Brown in the stomach while Meri was pregnant. It's the kind of allegation that immediately stops people in their tracks, not just because of how violent it sounds, but because of what it implies about the women involved, about what was happening behind closed doors, and about how much viewers may never have been told. And yet, despite how extreme the accusation is, it continues to circulate without any solid proof, without a confirmed timeline, and without a single first-hand account to back it up. So why does this rumor refuse to die? And more importantly, what does its persistence actually tell us? To answer that, you have to step back from the headline-grabbing version of the story and look instead at the environment it grew out of, because when you peel away the sensational framing, what you find isn't evidence of a hidden act of physical violence. What you find is a family system so emotionally volatile, so structurally flawed, and so resistant to accountability that it practically invites people to imagine something catastrophic must have happened. The rumor didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew out of years of documented tension between Meri and Janelle, tension that both women have openly acknowledged, albeit in very different ways. Long before Sister Wives became a polished reality show with confessionals and carefully edited story arcs, the Brown family was living a version of plural marriage that both Meri and Janelle have since described as deeply painful. In the early years of their shared marriage to Kody Brown, the relationship between the two women was strained from the start. Meri was the legal wife, the first wife, the one with status and symbolic authority. Janelle entered the family under circumstances that were already emotionally charged, having previously been married to Meri's brother, a detail that created discomfort and unresolved feelings before plural marriage even entered the picture. That alone would be enough to destabilize most relationships. Add to that the realities of early polygamous life, limited space, shared finances, unclear boundaries, and constant competition for emotional security, and it becomes easier to understand why both women later described that period as isolating and brutal. Meri has acknowledged that she was controlling and territorial in those years. Janelle has described herself as overwhelmed, emotionally shut down, and desperate for distance. Neither description paints a healthy picture. But neither, crucially, includes an accusation of physical violence, and that's where the rumor starts to unravel. Despite years of interviews, a published family book, countless hours of televised footage, and more recent seasons, where family members have become increasingly candid about past harms, there has never been a direct statement from Meri or Janelle confirming that a physical assault occurred, let alone one involving pregnancy. No clip, no quote, no corroborating account from another family member. What exists instead is a pattern of avoidance, euphemism, and half-spoken pain. The Browns have historically talked around conflict rather than through it, and those gaps, the moments where viewers sense something is being withheld, are exactly where speculation rushes in. When Meri has said she felt emotionally unsafe in the early years, some viewers have retroactively interpreted that as a euphemism for physical danger, when Janelle has talked about working long hours and staying away from home to avoid conflict. Some fans have read that as evidence of something darker brewing inside the household, but emotional unsafety and physical violence are not the same thing, and collapsing them into one another risks distorting what the women themselves have actually said. The pregnancy element of the rumor amplifies its shock value. It takes an already ugly interpersonal conflict and turns it into something far more sinister. And in the internet economy of outrage, the more extreme an allegation sounds, the faster it spreads, especially when it's attached to reality television figures whose lives have already been treated as communal property for over a decade. But when you look closely, the timelines never quite line up. Meri's fertility struggles and pregnancies have been discussed openly for years, and yet No version of the rumor has ever been able to place the alleged incident within a clearly documented period that matches known events. That inconsistency rarely stops the story from being repeated, but it does matter when assessing credibility. Defenders of Janelle often point out something else that's hard to ignore. Across nearly 2 decades of filming, no credible accusation of physical violence has ever been made against her. Not by Meri, not by Cody, not by another wife, and not by any outside source. Even people who criticize Janelle's emotional detachment or decision making tend to describe her as conflict, avoidant rather than aggressive, someone who retreats rather than escalates. That doesn't mean she's incapable of anger, but it does complicate the narrative that she would commit an act of extreme physical violence without it ever surfacing in any concrete way. At the same time, many supporters of Meri argue that her long arc of emotional pain, isolation, and eventual estrangement suggests her early experiences were far more traumatic than what viewers were shown. And that argument carries emotional weight. Meri's suffering is real. Her loneliness is visible, but empathy alone can't turn speculation into fact, especially when the person at the center of the alleged incident has never confirmed it herself. What often gets lost in the noise is that the most verifiable harm inside the Brown family wasn't caused by one explosive moment. It was systemic. It was baked into the structure of the marriage itself. Power flowed through Cody, resources were scarce, approval was conditional, and wives were subtly pitted against one another in ways that rewarded silence, endurance, and emotional suppression rather than honest conflict resolution. In that environment, resentment didn't need to turn physical to be devastating. It only needed time. And decades later, when viewers look back at a family that is now openly fractured, it becomes tempting to search for a single moment, a singular act that explains everything, something shocking enough to justify all that pain. The rumor fills that narrative gap perfectly. It offers a clear villain, a clear victim, and a moment of irreparable damage. But simple stories rarely explain complex realities. As this allegation continues to resurface across forums, comment sections, and social media timelines, it becomes increasingly clear that its endurance says less about uncovering a hidden act of violence and more about the unresolved emotional wreckage left behind by the Brown family's earliest years. Years the family themselves have described as chaotic, lonely, and deeply unsafe, especially for the women involved. By the time a rumor like this reaches mainstream fan spaces, it rarely looks the same as when it started. It's been reshaped, simplified, and emotionally charged along the way. And the allegation involving Janelle and Meri is a textbook example of how internet myth-making works, especially inside a fandom that's watched real pain unfold in slow motion for years. What's striking isn't just that the story exists, but how confidently it's often repeated. In some corners of the fandom, the question has quietly shifted from, "Did this happen?" to "Why hasn't this been talked about more?" That shift matters, because once an allegation is framed as something that was deliberately hidden, the absence of evidence starts getting treated as proof. The rumor tends to surface in waves. It reappears when old clips are reanalyzed, when a former wife speaks out, when viewers reassess earlier seasons through the lens of what they now know about how fractured the family became, and every time it comes back, it picks up new details that don't come from primary sources, but from interpretation layered on top of interpretation. In some versions of the story, the incident is described as an accident during a heated argument. In others, it's portrayed as an intentional act of rage. Sometimes it's framed as something Meri hinted at. Other times, it's repeated as unquestioned fact with no sourcing at all. The common thread isn't accuracy, it's emotional resonance. And that's the thing about rumors in fandom spaces. They don't survive because they're well supported. They survive because they feel true to people who already believe something went terribly wrong. This particular rumor gains traction because it aligns with what many viewers already suspect about the early Brown household. The stress was real. The resentment was real. The imbalance of power was real. So when someone introduces a shocking explanation for why relationships deteriorated so badly, it slides easily into place. What complicates this further is Meri's very real and very public struggle with fertility. That storyline has always been one of the most emotionally charged aspects of Sister Wives. Viewers watched her grieve. They watched her feel left behind as other wives had child after child. They watched her internalize loss in ways that were often painful to witness. So when a rumor ties that pain to physical harm during pregnancy, even without evidence, it taps directly into years of accumulated empathy. It reframes Meri not just as emotionally wounded, but as someone who may have been physically endangered. And once that framing takes hold, it becomes hard for some viewers to let go of it. But framing matters, because this rumor doesn't just suggest violence. It rewrites Meri's entire story into one of hidden victimization rather than collective dysfunction. And that's a powerful narrative shift, one that some people embrace wholeheartedly and others strongly resist. Those who reject the claim often point to something that gets overlooked in more sensational retellings. Meri herself has never substantiated it, and this is a woman who, in later seasons, has shown she's capable of naming mistreatment directly. She's called out emotional abandonment. She's spoken openly about isolation. She's confronted Cody and the family about years of neglect. Given the current cultural climate where personal truth telling is encouraged, rewarded, and often monetized, it raises a fair question. If something this severe had happened, why would it remain unspoken when so many other painful truths have finally been aired? Supporters of the rumor counter with an argument rooted in empathy that trauma doesn't always get disclosed, especially when it's embedded in a religious and cultural framework that discourages women from naming abuse. And that perspective deserves consideration. Many women stay silent for reasons that have nothing to do with credibility. But empathy still isn't evidence, and applying that logic retroactively, without any corroboration, creates a dangerous gray area where any unverified claim can be treated as plausible simply because silence exists. Another reason this rumor persists is the way audience perceptions of the wives have shifted over time. In earlier seasons, Meri was often framed as difficult, rigid, or emotionally volatile. Janelle, by contrast, was positioned as logical, easygoing, and low drama. But as the series progressed, and particularly as Robin became more widely viewed as the central antagonist, those early character assignments started to get re-examined. Suddenly, viewers were asking whether Janelle's emotional distance was really neutrality, or something colder, whether Meri's volatility was a reaction to long-term mistreatment rather than an inherent flaw in that reevaluation process. Rumors that once lived at the margins suddenly felt like missing puzzle pieces, and the pregnancy allegation fits that revised moral storyline almost too neatly. It offers a dramatic moment that explains why Meri never fully recovered, why trust was broken beyond repair, why early wounds never healed. The problem is, neat stories rarely reflect messy realities. Polygamy doesn't need a single act of violence to create lasting damage. The structure itself incentivizes competition over cooperation. Every major life domain, finances, affection, authority, motherhood, is filtered through one man's approval. And when resources are limited and hierarchy is ambiguous, resentment doesn't just build, it calcifies. Janelle has consistently described herself as pragmatic and conflict avoidant, someone who chooses distance over confrontation. Meri has acknowledged that her response to insecurity often manifested as control. Put those traits together under constant pressure, and you don't get peace. You get a slow, grinding dysfunction that wears everyone down. That kind of environment can leave deep scars without ever crossing into physical violence. And when people conflate emotional harm with physical assault, they risk flattening the complexity of what actually happened. There's also an ethical dimension to this conversation that rarely gets addressed. Repeating an unverified allegation, especially one involving harm to a pregnant woman, does real damage even when it's framed as a question. In the court of public opinion, repetition itself becomes a verdict, and once a rumor reaches that stage, disclaimers tend to get ignored. At the same time, the fact that this rumor continues to spark debate speaks volumes about how deeply viewers were affected by watching a family that once claimed moral clarity slowly unravel. The dissonance between the ideal the Browns presented and the reality that emerged created a hunger for explanations. For a moment that made it all make sense, and that hunger is powerful. But power doesn't equal truth. One of the reasons this rumor has such staying power is because it distracts from a harder truth, one that's far less dramatic, but far more uncomfortable. And that truth is this: The Brown family didn't need a single violent incident to produce the level of harm we witnessed. The system itself did that job over time. Polygamy, as practiced in the Brown household, wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was a hierarchy, and hierarchies don't require cruelty to function. But they often produce it anyway, especially when emotional needs outpace available resources. Every wife entered the marriage with expectations that couldn't realistically be met simultaneously, and instead of addressing that imbalance directly, the structure encouraged adaptation through silence, endurance, and self-denial. In that system, Cody Brown was the gatekeeper, not just of affection, but of legitimacy. His approval determined emotional safety, financial stability, and social standing within the family. And while the wives were often encouraged to work things out among themselves, they were doing so inside a framework that rewarded compliance over honesty. That dynamic matters, because it explains why so much conflict between Meri and Janelle played out indirectly. It wasn't just about personality clashes. It was about survival inside a system that forced women to negotiate power horizontally, while authority remained vertical. Meri, as the first and legal wife, entered the family with symbolic status, but diminishing security. Janelle, entering later, had fewer formal privileges, but more emotional flexibility. Those differences shaped how each woman responded to stress. Meri leaned into control. Janelle leaned into distance. Neither approach resolved the underlying problem, and both contributed to long-term resentment. This is where the rumor becomes tempting. It offers a shortcut. Instead of grappling with years of subtle cumulative harm, it presents a single moment of undeniable wrongdoing, a moment that absolves the structure and places blame squarely on one person. But the Browns' own words tell a different story. When the women talk about those early years, they don't describe a household punctuated by explosive violence. They describe loneliness, emotional starvation, constant tension, a feeling of being unseen and unsupported. Those experiences don't lend themselves to viral sound bites, but they're far more consistent across accounts. Janelle has repeatedly emphasized how often she chose physical absence as a coping mechanism. Working long hours, staying away from home, minimizing interaction. That behavior is sometimes misread as indifference, but it can also be understood as self-preservation. Avoidance isn't proof of aggression. In many cases, it's the opposite. Meri, on the other hand, has described feeling trapped in a role that stripped her of agency while simultaneously holding her responsible for maintaining harmony. That contradiction, being both powerless and blamed, can produce intense emotional responses. Control becomes a way to reclaim stability, even when it alienates others. None of this paints either woman as a villain. It paints them as participants in a system that rewarded coping mechanisms rather than healing. And this is where the rumor becomes not just inaccurate, but misleading. Because by focusing on whether one woman committed an act of physical violence, the conversation shifts away from the broader accountability of the structure and of Cody's leadership within it. If a shocking incident had occurred, it would raise serious questions about how it was handled. Who knew? Who intervened? Why was it never addressed? But in the absence of evidence, the fixation on that possibility risks letting the more verifiable harms off the hook. There's also something telling about how often this rumor resurfaces alongside discussions of Meri's fertility struggles. Fertility in the Brown family wasn't just personal, it was political. Children were currency. They determined relevance, influence, and emotional security. And Meri's inability to have more children placed her at a permanent disadvantage in a system that valued motherhood above nearly everything else. That reality alone explains much of her pain. It explains her isolation. It explains her sensitivity to rejection. It explains why she often appeared emotionally raw while others seemed more grounded. None of that requires an act of physical violence to be true. Yet the rumor persists because it aligns with a cultural tendency to look for trauma that feels concrete. Emotional neglect is hard to quantify. Structural harm is difficult to narrate, but a single violent act is easy to understand, easy to condemn, and easy to remember. This tendency is especially strong in reality television fandoms, where viewers are trained to think in terms of arcs, villains, and turning points. We want moments that explain everything, and when the show itself doesn't provide them, audiences create their own. What's rarely acknowledged is how much damage that process can do to real people. Even framing the allegation as a hypothetical keeps it alive. Each repetition reinforces the association, and over time, the distinction between rumor and reality blurs, not because evidence emerges, but because familiarity breeds belief. There's also the question of who benefits from this narrative. Sensational claims drive clicks. Outrage fuels engagement. And in online spaces, where attention is currency, restraint rarely wins. Nuanced conversations about emotional harm and systemic dysfunction don't spread as fast as shocking allegations. But truth isn't obligated to be entertaining. As the fandom continues to reassess the Browns' history, it's worth asking what kind of accountability actually leads to understanding. Is it more useful to speculate about an unverified act of violence, or to confront the documented ways the family structure failed the women involved? Because if we're honest, the story the Browns themselves have told, over years in fragments and contradictions, is already damning enough. A household built on unequal power, emotional needs unmet, conflict discouraged rather than resolved, pain normalized rather than addressed. Those are the realities that shaped everything that followed. By the time you've traced this rumor from its origins to its many retellings, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Its power doesn't come from what's been proven. It comes from what's been left unresolved. The question of whether Janelle Brown need Meri Brown in the stomach during a pregnancy has lingered for years, not because evidence keeps surfacing, but because clarity never fully arrived. And in the absence of clarity, people fill the gaps with meaning, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes recklessly, often emotionally. What makes this story especially volatile is that it exists at the intersection of very real pain and very speculative accusation. The pain is documented. The fractures are visible. The emotional damage has been acknowledged by nearly everyone involved. But the specific act that the rumor centers on remains unsupported by any first-hand account, timeline, or corroborating source. And that distinction matters in internet culture. Silence is often interpreted as confirmation. If no one denies something loudly enough, the assumption becomes that there must be a reason. But silence can mean many things. It can mean exhaustion. It can mean refusal to legitimize harmful speculation. It can mean protecting children and grandchildren from narratives that would only deepen wounds rather than heal them. Neither TLC nor the Brown family has ever publicly addressed this specific claim. And while some interpret that as suspicious, it's just as plausible that responding would only amplify a story that doesn't deserve oxygen, especially one that accuses a real person of serious violence without proof. What gets lost in the fixation on this allegation is the harm that is undeniable. Harm that didn't happen in one moment, but over years. Harm that didn't require fists or knees, but thrived on neglect, competition, and emotional abandonment. The Brown family system rewarded endurance over honesty. It prized harmony on the surface while discouraging direct confrontation. Women were expected to manage their own pain quietly while maintaining a collective image of unity. And when that image cracked, the fallout was blamed on personalities rather than structure. That's the uncomfortable truth. It wasn't one wife versus another that caused the family to fracture. It was a model that placed impossible demands on human relationships and then framed failure as a personal shortcoming rather than a systemic flaw. In that context, it makes sense that viewers want a moment they can point to. A single event that explains why Meri never fully felt secure, why Janelle disengaged, why resentment hardened instead of softening. But life, especially life inside rigid belief systems, rarely provides that kind of narrative clarity, and insisting on it can do real damage. Repeating an unverified allegation doesn't just risk misrepresenting the past. It risks shaping the present, because once a rumor becomes part of someone's public identity, it doesn't fade easily. Even when framed as speculation, it can alter how a person is perceived permanently. At the same time, dismissing the rumor outright without acknowledging the environment it emerged from would also be a mistake. People don't invent these stories for no reason. They arise because something felt wrong, because pain was visible. Because the official version of events never fully accounted for what viewers were witnessing. But feeling wrong isn't the same as being factual. The most responsible conclusion isn't that a shocking act was hidden from view. It's that the Brown family structure fostered long-term emotional damage that manifested in quieter, more corrosive ways. Resentment that calcified, trust that eroded, and relationships that never recovered once the cracks formed. Those realities may not deliver the punch of a viral headline, but they're the truths most consistently supported by the women's own words over time. And maybe that's the hardest part for audiences to accept, that there isn't a single villain, no clear-cut moment where everything broke. Just a slow accumulation of harm in a system that asked too much and gave too little in return. So when the question resurfaces, did Janelle Brown knee Meri Brown while she was pregnant? The most honest answer remains unsatisfying to those craving certainty. There is no verified evidence that it happened. What is verified is that the women involved lived for years in an emotionally unsafe environment, that they were encouraged to compete rather than collaborate, that their pain was often minimized or redirected instead of addressed, and that the damage from those years lingered long after the cameras started rolling. And maybe that's where the focus belongs. Not on an unproven act of violence, but on the very real emotional wreckage that didn't need violence to be devastating. Because sometimes the truth isn't louder than the rumor. It's quieter, more complex, and harder to sit with. But it's also the only place where understanding and accountability can actually begin.